Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday night and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Torah portion is Shlach. The biblical scouts exclaim, "We looked like grasshoppers to ourselves, and so we must have looked to the inhabitants of Canaan." Traditionally, this lack of self-esteem is attributed to a slave and later ghetto mentality that kept the Jewish people in exile for 2,000 years. So join us as we explore the Grasshopper Mentality and the New Jew. Well, welcome back, Rabbi. Another week of Madlik Disruptive Torah. And before we begin, I always like to share with you if we get any feedback from the prior podcast. I received an email from Rabbi Kenny Brander, the head of Or Torah, who wrote the tshuva that we talked about in last week's episode of Kosher Queer, and he liked our treatment of it. So for those of you who haven't read it, go to the Or Torah website, download the tshuva, and it's a movement. So that was the good news from last week. I should mention, we are a podcast. If you listen to this as a podcast, be sure to like us, give us some stars, and maybe say something nice, because that keeps us going. So last year, Rabbi, we did something a little bit different. We looked at a bunch of verses through a lens. And I really found it fascinating to do that. And with your permission, we're going to do the same thing this week. We are going to look at this iconic story of the spies, the scouts, and the punishment for their evil, or I should say, overcautious report by dying out in the wilderness. We're going to look at it through the lens of Rav Kook, who saw it through the lens of the Talmud. And I think it's going to make us read it totally differently. So here we go. We mentioned this in another episode. I believe it was on Tisha B'Av, because it is based on the fact that, we love to say that every time we do a parsha, it is the most important story in the whole Torah. And I am telling you tonight, this is the worst sin in the whole Torah. And according to the Talmud, as quoted by Rav Kook, this was the source of all calamities that occurred to the Jewish people, because it happened on Tisha B'Av. And when God forgave them, he uses the words that we use on the highest holiday of the year for forgiving. So in this story, you could make the case, is the core for the greatest sin of the Jewish people, where they fell off the mark, and the moment that they were redeemed. So basically, Rav Kook says as follows. You all know, and actually Rav Kook is famous for saying that the temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, hatred that had no basis. But in this particular case, Rav Kook says, no, that's not the case. The reason why it was destroyed was because of baseless crying, the whining, the timidity, the lack of faith of the scouts brought all calamities upon Israel, and that is the source of everything. So we are going to read these verses through that lens. Rav Kook clearly was not only a great Torah scholar, he was also the person who created a Jewish religious theology around Zionism and going up into the land. And here we have a story where the first Israelites had the option, the possibility to go up into the land, and they didn't go. So that sets the stage for our story. We are in Numbers 13, and as you probably all know, God spoke to Moses saying, send agents, send scouts to scout the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelite people. And you should get one participant from each of the ancestral tribes, each one chieftain among them. It is not exactly the same list of princes that we've had before. The commentaries explain because what you needed in this particular case was anoshim. You needed strong warriors, leaders, men of vision. And he starts to give a list of who represented all of the different tribes. The tribe of Reuben, Shemuah, son of Zakur. The tribe of Shimon, Tzfat, son of Hori. And from the tribe of Judah, Caleb, son of Yefuneh. Keep that in mind. That's going to be important later. And then he goes through a whole list of all of the other princes or leaders, I should say. And then he says in verse 16, these were the names of the participants who Moses sent to scout the land. But Moses changed the name of Hoshea, son of Nun, to Yehoshua, to Joshua. So predicting what's going to happen, we already have Caleb ben Yefuneh, who, if I'm correct, wasn't one of the original Nasi'im from that brought the sacrifices from Yehuda, but he is singled out, we'll see in a second. And we have Joshua, who goes through a name change. And then it says, when Moses sent them to scout the land of Canaan, he said to them, go up there into the Negeb and on into the hill country. He says that you should, va'alitem et ahar, go up the hill. And he said to them, see what kind of country it is. Are the people who dwell in it strong or weak, few or many? Is the country in which they dwell good or bad? Are the towns they live in open or fortified? Is the soil rich or poor? Is it wooded or not? And take pains to bring back some of the fruit of the land. So we have in this rendering of the story, we have God initiating this thing of sending the scouts without any commentary, so to speak. And then we have Moses, who, when I read this, Rabbi, I was struck. It almost sounded like it was Moses, the Prince of Egypt, talking. He really had no clue about this land that he was taking his people to. He's the one who adds all of these questions. Some of the questions are the types of questions that you would expect. Tactical questions. Is it armed? Or is it fortified? But then he also asks questions of someone who is clueless about this historic legacy of the Israelite people. Is it the soil rich or poor? Is it wooded or not? So I was struck by that as well. And then, of course, the spies or the scouts, they go into the land and they find the Anakites. The word Anak means great, means giants. So they went into a place that was called the place of the Anakites, and they go to Hebron, which was founded 7 years before Tzon of Egypt. So we have our first reference to comparing this land of Canaan to Egypt. And they go through, and then they come back. At the end of 40 days, they returned from scouting the land. They went straight to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran. And they made their report to them and to the whole community as they showed them the fruit of the land. This is what they told them. We came to the land you sent us to. It does indeed flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who inhabit the country are powerful. In the Hebrew, the word for however is not what you'd expect, maybe aval. The word is ephes, which in modern day Hebrew means zero. But what they're really saying is it's all not worth anything. As beautiful as the fruits are, as flowing as the milk and honey is, ephes, it doesn't mean anything. Ka'az ha'am hayoshev ba'aretz. Because the people that are inhabiting the land are powerful, the cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the Anakites there. We saw these giants. And to add insult to injury, the Amalekites, our enemy from the first moment we became a nation, dwell in the Negev. And at this point in time, Caleb, who we were introduced to before, who comes from the tribe of Judah, stands up. And Caleb hushed the people before Moses and said, "Let us by all means go up, and we shall gain possession of it, for we shall surely overcome it." The Hebrew is aleh na'aleh v'yershanu oto ki yochel nuchal la. If the word aleh reminds you of the word aliyah, which is the modern term for immigrating to Israel, there's a good reason for it. This is the iconic story for Jews deciding whether to come and take the chance, take the gamble, take the plunge, and inherit the land or not. Then the other men who had gone up with him said, "We cannot attack that people, for it is stronger than we." Thus they spread calumnies among the Israelites about the land they had scouted, saying, "The country that we traversed and scouted is one that devours its settlers. Eretz ochelet yoshveh. It eats the people that live there. All the people that we saw in it are of great size. They're all giants. We looked like grasshoppers to ourselves, and so we must have looked to them." So those are the words that I took in terms of the title for this, The Grasshopper Mentality. Rabbi, I'm going to stop for a second here. We're going to see how this story was treated in the next chapter of Numbers. But what are your feelings now in terms of the power of the story, the what we're being set up for, and its importance for the history of the Jewish people?
So your reading was really a dramatic reading, and obviously what we're talking about here, the dramatic reading sets up the fact that this story is an important story, not just for what happened, but but going forward. What I would just say about this story is, it's not entirely clear what the spies did wrong. What exactly was it? And why does the Torah end the description by saying that they thought their self-perception was no good? They saw themselves as grasshoppers, and therefore the people saw them as grasshoppers. Is it possible that was ultimately their sin? That the report itself wasn't the problem? The problem was the fact that they saw themselves as grasshoppers. I wonder about that.
I think that's a great question. Now, of course, the chapters in the Torah are not necessarily. We'd have to ask your wife in the Codex where these came from. But the story does continue, and it goes from chapter 13 to chapter 14. But you are absolutely correct. Chapter 13 stops at a dramatic moment, and you almost feel maybe that's the crux of the problem. So let's continue reading. In chapter 14, it says, "The whole community broke into loud cries, and the people wept that night." Ha'am vayivchu ha'am balayla hahu. So this is where Rav Kook got the sense of the temple was destroyed. The Jewish people lost their nation. They were exiled because of whining, because of crying for no reason. All the Israelites rallied against Moses and Aaron and said, and here we're getting to Egypt in a big way, "If only we had died in the land of Egypt," the whole community shouted at them. "Or if only we might die in this wilderness. Why is God taking us to that land to fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be carried off. It would be better for us to go back to Egypt." And then they said to one another, "Let us head back for Egypt." When Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembled congregation of Israel. So Moses and Aaron here are absolutely cut to the core. The carpet has been pulled out beneath them. And we can discuss a little bit later their leadership or lack thereof that they have shown or not shown to this point. But now we have our leaders of the future. Then, and Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Yefunah, of those who had scouted the land, rent their clothes, karu bigdehem, just as a mourner would, and exhorted the whole Israelite community. The land that we traversed and scouted is an exceedingly good land. If pleased with us, God will bring us into the land that flows with milk and honey. Then they go on, "Have no fear then of the people of the country, for they are our prey. Their protection has departed from them, but God is with us. Have no fear of them." So this is almost the bookend of the grasshoppers, where they are, in a sense, staking their claim, and they are saying, what is your problem? Your problem is fear. Even more than lack of trust in God, it's the fear. As the whole community threatened to pelt them with stones, the presence of God appeared in the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. So the story could end here, but now we're going to get into the after story and the punishment. And God said to Moses, "How long will this people spurn me? And how long will they have no faith in me despite all the signs I have performed in their midst? I will strike them with pestilence and disown them. V'yoresheni." He literally is a dad who wants to disown his kids. "And I will make of you a nation far more numerous than they." So God is now offering Moses, we're going to make a fresh start. I can't deal with this rabble. But Moses said to God, so now we have Moses' argument in defense of the children of Israel. "When the Egyptian from whose midst you brought us, this people, in your might, hear the news, they will tell it to the inhabitants of the land. Now they have heard that you, Hashem, are in the midst of this people, that you, God, appear in plain sight when your cloud rests over them, and when you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day. And if you slay them, the people, the nations who have heard your fame will say, it must be because God was powerless to bring that people into the land, promised them on oath that God slaughtered them." In the Hebrew, it says in verse 15, "V'amru hagoyim asher shamu et shamcha lemor." Because we are reading this through the lens of the ghetto Jew, the grasshopper Jew, the slave Jew, you cannot but hear Moses' argument to God is, what will the goyim say? It's almost as if baked into the story is also a God of a ghetto Jew. He's saying to God literally the argument that we tell amongst ourselves all the time. What will the goyim say? You can't do this, God. What will the goyim say? I was blown away by that. And then, of course, he brings the words of forgiveness that we say during Slichot and on the highest holidays of the year. Hashem erech apayim v'rav chesed nosa avon v'fesha v'nakeh lo yinakeh. Therefore I pray, let God forgive them. And at the end it says the punchline, v'yomer Hashem salachti kidvarecha, I will forgive them. So here we have, I would argue, the original sin of the Jewish people and God forgiving them based on an argument of what will the goyim say. What do you say, Rabbi?
Well, first of all, God forgave them, but they had to they had to wander in the desert for 40 years. So he forgives them that he doesn't destroy them, but he doesn't forgive them that he doesn't punish them. I think that's a very important point on this first sin of the Jewish people, that there has to be punishment for the first sin of the Jewish people. The same way there was punishment for the first sin when Adam and Eve ate from the fruit. They weren't killed, but there is punishment. And that's a very important thing about these big sins. There has to be some kind of punishment, some type of recognition of the kind of the gravity of what happened.
Absolutely. But also the sin, I should say the punishment, is as much a punishment as a fait accompli, meaning to say it was clear that these people were incapable of entering the land. And one of the arguments that they make is that our wives and our children will be killed. And if you read the verses, and there's a source sheet attached to this, God pulls that and points that back at them and says, you're going to die, but those children who you were so concerned about, those new generation, that generation born at least not in slavery, they're going to inherit the land. There is clear in those words that part of it is a punishment, but part of it is also the recognition on the part of God that these people just, you can't take someone from one place to another in one generation. It takes time and it takes change. In a previous episode, we talked about this whole concept of the reason the Jews had to dwell for 40 years wasn't so much as a punishment, Maimonides says. It just takes time to move people from one place to another. It was almost preordained. So normally I would stop here, but the story doesn't end. There's one more part of it. In 1440, it says the following. And it says, early the next morning, their fighting force, meaning the 10 scouts who had just been punished, who had just realized that they had brought doom upon the Jewish people, set out toward the crest of the hill. Va'alu el Rosh Har. They went to the top of that hill. We are prepared to go up to the place of God has spoken, for we were wrong, they say. But Moses said, why do you transgress God's command? This will not succeed. Do not go up, lest you be routed by the enemies. They go into a fight. The Amaleks and the Canaanites who dwelt in the hill country came down and dealt them a shattering blow. So the end of the story is the 10 scouts finally say, we've got to have some guts, and we've got to go and take the land. And because God was not with them, and Moses said to them basically, don't go. It's not the right time. Would not be it would not be the right thing to do. They go, and whether they were killed or they were beaten badly is an open question. But this is the whole story. There are nuances to it in the version in Deuteronomy. It has them deciding, let us send agents. The idea comes from the Jewish people or Moses. In Joshua, the story is written about as well. It has an amazing line in it. And he says, they took the heart out of our people. Himsiv et lev ha'am. So this is a core story, and what I want to do in the 10 or so minutes that remain is to look at it from the perspective of the Zionist endeavor, look at it from the perspective of the paradigm shift that occurred when we in modern times gave up our ghetto mentality, which in this story was the slave mentality, and decided to go and take the land. And I think if we start to go through it now, it will be fascinating. So let us start. The Ibn Ezra on 13a says the meaning of men. Why does it say anashim? It's because they were strong. These were not pious Jews. These were powerful Jews. The point of this was to make a Jew, an Israelite who had previously been a slave, be able to take the land. The interesting case of Caleb, son of Yefunah. It turns out, if you read the Chezkuni and other commentaries, that he is identical with Caleb, the son of Chetzron, and ultimately, he didn't come from totally Jewish roots. I have to say, Rabbi, when I Googled Grasshopper Mentality, every hit that I got was Christian, not Jewish. The Christians love this.
The Jews don't talk about this?
No. I'm going to talk in a second about the first Zionists that I saw talk about the grasshoppers. But the Christians not only talk about it, but there are certain rabbis who are very involved with evangelical Judaism, Christianity, and they talk about it too because they say Caleb is you. He is a non-Jew like Jethro who came and taught the Jews how to man up. So now we have the two protagonists. One is Caleb ben Yefunah, who didn't come from a slave mentality, you could make the argument, and Joshua, who God gave a new name to. Moses gave a new name to. Rashi says, and Moses called Hoshea the son of Nun Yehoshua, by giving him his name Yehoshua, which is a compound of Yah, which is God, and Hosha, it means God may save. He in effect prayed for him, may God save you from the evil counsel of the spies. My reading of that is the protagonists of these stories are paradigm shifters. They are breaking out of the mold, and that is what this dialectic is between those stuck in the past, in the slavery of their past, and those who are willing to, for no better reason than having no fear and faith, willing to make the paradigm shift.
I mean, that is really, really good. I mean, that idea of paradigm shift, and I mean, you're connecting it to the grasshopper mentality, because, when the fear of making a paradigm shift is that you feel inadequate, and that's the grasshopper mentality.
Yes. So the early Zionists talk about, and I'm going to quote Aleph Dalet Gordon. He was a labor Zionist. He believed in working the land. He wrote, "We are a parasitic people. We have no roots in the soil. There is no ground beneath our feet. And we are parasites, not only in an economic sense, but in spirit, in thought, in poetry, in literature, in our virtues, our ideals, our higher human aspirations." There was Max Nordau, who literally believed in muscular Judaism. In the speech at the Second Zionist Congress, he spoke about the need to design the new Jew and reject the old Jew, when the mental and physical strength to achieve the goals of Zionism. Yosef Chaim Brenner advocated an extreme form of the concept. He describes Jews in the Pale of Settlement as poor, mentally, morally, spiritually disfigured, panicky, humiliated, disoriented, with no realistic view of life, depressed, despised, sloven of dress, lacking taste, unwilling to defend themselves against violence, desperate, and feeling at the same time inferior and part of a chosen people. I think if you needed to get a commentary on what this grasshopper mentality is, you couldn't go wrong by looking at how the early Zionists described the Jews prior to the formation of the State of Israel.
I think that's right. Now, your whole discussion here raises such an interesting issue. And that is that the early Zionists look to the stories in the Torah as models, even though they weren't necessarily religious people, because the stories of the Torah are models for Jewish history. It has nothing to do with whether or not you go to shul on Shabbat morning and you listen to the Torah reading. These are models, and those early Zionists wanted to see models within Jewish history. So I think that's also an interesting point. The very fact that they use this material, and this is a point that you made when we talked about the Zionists, like the kibbutz haggadahs, and that is the very fact that the kibbutzniks looked to the Haggadah is in itself fascinating.
Absolutely. So I couldn't believe, if you're listening to this podcast and you know more about Zionist thought than I do, and you can find a reference of the early Zionists to the grasshoppers, please contact us. The only reference that I got was one where Yitzhak Shamir, the prime minister of Israel, who was not known for his eloquence, made a speech and the whole world jumped all over him. It was in 1988, and he said as follows. It was at a dedication of a new tourist site in the ancient Herodian fortress. He said, "From this mountain we see not only the past but also the present. Some people are running wild down below. Some want to sabotage what we are building, what we have built and what we have established. There are those who say that Jews are invaders in this country, aliens, and that the true owners of the land are the rioters, the murderers and the terrorists who seek to destroy any remnant of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. We say to them, when we look from here on the thousands of years of our past and all that we have established in the present, that they are as grasshoppers in our sight. The age-old Jewish people, inspired by the spirit of Israel, will overcome its enemies." So everybody went crazy saying that he was calling the Palestinians grasshoppers. And if you look at the source sheet, you have an article by Charles Krautheimer in the New York Times and elsewhere, bringing them back to our psukim and our verses and saying that he was talking less about them and more about us. But Rabbi, I hear what you're saying, and I expected to be in a total agreement with you that these secular Zionists nonetheless hearken back to the Torah and said, we are on the side of Joshua, we are on the side of Caleb, we want to take the land. But there is an amazing twist. Because if you remember at the end of the story, the 10 went and started a war. They actually went to the top of the same mountain that they were asked to go to at the beginning of the story. And the word that is used is vayapilu. And there's a wonderful piece by Professor David Golikin, and he talks about that these 10 Jews, with their army, went to the top of the hill, and they fought. And if we skip forward 3,000 years, says Geiken, to the Israeli composer, poet, writer Levin Knipas. He made Aliyah in 1930 from Ukraine at the age of 23. In 1919, he writes the song Hama'apilim. And the words are the song that were taken by the Jabotinsky Jews, the Jews that believed in taking the whole land and fighting for it. And the name of the song is "To the Top of the Mountain, to the Top of the Mountain, who will stop those going to Bedim from captivity?" The amazing thing is they use the word that is used not by Joshua and not by Caleb, but it's used by the 10 who are told by Moses, God is not with you, do not go. So it's so fascinating that I'm agreeing with you in the sense that they understood the nuances of this story, but they took it even further. They said, if we want to copy somebody, we want to copy the 10 scouts who learned their lesson, who knew that not only was the statistics against them, but maybe even God was against them. Maybe they were going against the rabbis of their time and they were going to attack. I just find that to be amazing that they took that part of the story to show that the rebirth of the Jewish people, of the Jewish nation, meant that one had to break all of the paradigms. Just unbelievable.
I think this is great. This is amazing. Geoffrey, because we really took it in a completely different direction than people usually read these verses. I think that's fantastic. So thank you, Geoffrey. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Next week, Geoffrey is going to be traveling, but we will be doing a lunch and learn next week for Parshat Korach. So we'll see you at 12 noon next Thursday. Shabbat shalom, everybody, and thank you again, Geoffrey, for an absolutely amazing development.
So, Rabbi, don't go quite yet, because I have a little surprise, a treat for you. As those in the audience decide whether to raise their hands and come up, I am going to play that song, the top of the mountain, for you here on Madlik. And here we go. The Rosh Hashar. Okay, well, I thought that was a little bit of a treat. The old days we used to end with this song.
That's fantastic. Enjoy. That's great.
Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom,
and make sure you always go to Rosh Hashar, to the top of the mountain. So, fans, any comments, any insights that we might have missed? Some of the things that I wanted to discuss in terms of this whole ghetto mentality was, it's not so clear that everything about the ghetto was bad. I do quote Salo Baron and some other historians that actually explain how the ghetto gave the Jewish people the ability to integrate into the world of society and science. And so that is kind of fascinating. But the most fascinating part that you will find in the Sephirah sheets, I believe, is actually a professor of law named Michael Henry Davis, who actually talks, if you focused a little bit on how we were dealing at the end with Moses, where Moses is a kind of a funny character in this story. He talks about sending the spies to Israel to find out if the earth is good. He speaks a little bit like a foreigner who knows nothing about it. And then he tells the 10 scouts not to go. And the later Zionists say, no, you don't listen to the Moses of your days. You just go. And this, Michael Henry Davis writes an amazing, I think, monograph on how do you decide who, in fact, is in the camp of the ghetto mentality and who is in the camp of the grasshopper and who is in the camp of the nation builder and of the person who takes the future into his own hands. And some of the arguments that he makes is that if you look at, for instance, and he wrote this 10 years ago, if you look, for instance, at some of the students of Meir Kahana and the people that are saying we don't need to listen to what the world says, and we don't have to look over our shoulder because we are not the ghetto Jews. In fact, he makes a case that they are actually showcasing a ghetto mentality with their concern for what others think. And in fact, the confident Jew, the confident Israeli can afford to be magnanimous, can afford to take risks for peace, and doesn't have to live his life based on either what the world says or in reacting to what the world says. So I find that fascinating. If you're listening to this as a podcast, please listen to the Sephirah notes. Lauren, how are you today?
I'm well, thank you, Geoffrey. I just had a thought. Is it possible that there was an evolution of the non-grasshopper within biblical text? I was reading an article this week about the similarity between the Garden of Eden, Joseph and the brothers that threw him into the pit, and then the Caleb Joshua story. is it possible that, and this may be way off base, but is it possible that Adam really was the first non-grasshopper? He was the person that may have established a thread of going against what the dictum at the time was, the breadth of the story.
I think you're very close, but I think it's Eve.
Okay. Adam or Eve. Okay.
Yeah, I think Adam was, if anything, he was the timid ghetto Jew. When God comes and says, "What have you done?" He goes, "It's my wife." I think that Eve is definitely she broke. There was a law and she broke it. And she broke it because you can look at leaving Eden as exile, and you can look at leaving Eden as leaving the womb and leaving the fuzzy spot and the bubble, maybe even leaving Egypt, where the watermelons are available, and yes, you have rules, but you get fed a square meal 3 times a day. And she was the one who projected mankind on the journey that we're on now. But I love it. I love the parallel between Eve and the original sin and mankind, and the characters that we came across today. And again, I think that if there's anything that comes out of the way we read the story, there's no one here is on one side or the other holy. And I think that ultimately is the essence of the grasshopper, of the slave mentality, of the ghetto Jew. You never can literally break free of the neuroses of your past, but you can try. And so, Moses is a leader, but sure enough, you listen to him, and he's talking a lot like someone who's almost, he's not sure he wants to go into land. He says, check the earth, bring back some fruit. And you have the scouts who are just overwhelmed by fear, and at the end, they say, we get the message, screw it. And maybe they're the ones who broke out of the model. It's just so fascinating because I think it's real life. Pointing fingers at one another and saying, you're the gullus Jew, or you can't get rid of your phobias, is never a good look. And I think that partly is the message here, and what makes the story so fascinating. But I love bringing in Eden.
Okay. Well, Shabbat Shalom. The other paragraph that you read about, it must be God. It must be because God was powerless to bring the people out of the land into the land. That was a real challenge. You focused in on that at the beginning of the presentation, and I didn't really focus in on that, but it's a very powerful comment on don't stay with the static quo, the status quo. So I think we have some real powerful examples in our literature about what it is to be an individual and to think like an individual and to go forward and not necessarily stay in the same lane.
Absolutely. And I was talking less about God and more about Moses' perception of God. I think that the fact that he could bring up that argument to the Almighty God, what are the neighbors going to say, what are the Goyim going to say, really gives much more insight into him than it does into God. Right. And I found that to be fascinating too. Well, Lauren,
thanks so much.
Shabbat Shalom. Thanks as always for joining.
Bye-bye.